Hello, my name is Lauren LaFavor. I'm a 30-year-old college student here at Bakersfield College. Throughout this course, I've learned that many of my views operate from a conflict perspective. Although definitely not a fan of socialism, I've always been really interested in the writings and theories of Karl Marx. I believe by studying his perspectives, we can gain valuable insight into the modern world and problems that require our solutions. Next. With that being said, the 19th century founding father that I chose is Karl Marx. Marx was born in London in 1818, he was born in Germany in 1818 and died in London in 1883. He was a German sociologist, economist, and revolutionary. He worked mainly in the field of political philosophy, and he was known for writing the Communist Manifesto, one of the most celebrated writings of the socialist movement. Next. So Marx's social thoughts, theories, and perspectives. According to Chambliss and Iglesias, Marx believed that almost all societies throughout human history have been divided into economic classes, with one class benefiting at the expense of others. Human history should therefore be understood as a product of this class conflict. And class conflict is the competition between classes over the distribution of wealth, power, and other valued resources within a society. Marx believed that eventually the exploited workers of a capitalist society would rise up against those in control. He believed that no one class should have power over another. So we've seen today many of his predictions regarding capitalism actually come true. For instance, the means of production becoming concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, like we see with big conglomerates such as Walmart, who incidentally have been slammed time and time again for their exploitation of cheap laborers. So in essence, Marx believed that a capitalist society was immoral. A small group of wealthy capitalists are able to exploit and dominate the lower classes for labor. I believe we can see the ills of this current system today. According to the United Nations, we live in a world where 25,000 people around the globe die each day from starvation and related causes. Yet we live in a planet with enough food to feed every man, woman, and child, just not enough money to pay for it. Next. So what is the sociological imagination? In 1955, sociologist C. Wright Mills defined the sociological imagination as the ability to see the impact of social forces on individuals' private and public lives. The sociological imagination gives us a lens to view the world and situations within it from different perspectives that allow for greater insight into the whys of what's going on in the world around us. When we look at the macro level of society and the micro level, which is the individual. Mills wrote in his 1959 book, The Sociological Imagination, that when classes rise or fall, a person is employed or unemployed. When the rate of investment goes up or goes down, a person either takes new hard or goes broke. When wars happen, an insurance salesperson now becomes a rocket launcher, a store clerk. A wife or husband lives alone, a child grows up without a parent. Neither the life of an individual or the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. Next. So why it's important to view society with the lens of the sociological imagination. I believe it's so important to view society with the lens of the sociological imagination because it allows us to not only make better decisions for ourselves, but for society as a whole. According to Mills, by employing the sociological imagination, individual people are forced to perceive from an objective position events, attitudes, and social structures that influence our culture. Every person could benefit greatly from employing this kind of thinking. It's a form of critical thinking that I believe today's day and age is seriously lacking. Imagine instead of just turning on the TV and taking anything the media says as absolute fact, people were able to say, wait a second, I know XYZ is also caused by this factor and this factor. It arms people with knowledge so that they don't become a product of their environment and circumstance. So, for instance, if a young mother is faced with the decision of living in a nicer home but a worse neighborhood, or a good neighborhood but worse house, Utilizing the sociological imagination, she may look into and understand the implications of raising her child in a bad neighborhood. For instance, school completion rate, crime rate, violence, and she'd be better equipped to make the best decision for her and her family. Next. 3 classical social theories. So we have structural functionism, which was coined by Emil Durkheim. And structural functionism basically sees society as one complex body whose structure works together in a fashion that promotes stability. So we would see society as the body, and the various organs would be the structures, all working together in one mechanism. In this theory, there's a large influence on structures and their functions, and if something did not have a function, it would cease to exist in society. Next, we have social conflict, which was coined by Karl Marx. Investopedia states that conflict theory focuses on the competition between groups within society over limited resources. So conflict theory views social and economic institutions as tools of the struggle between groups or classes used to maintain inequality and dominance of the ruling class. Next, we have symbolic interactionism, which was coined by Max Weber and George Herbert Mead, which basically focuses on the socially constructed sense of self and the utilization and value in which we place on language and symbols in order to convey meaning with others. Next. So, institutions. Social institutions are mechanisms or patterns of social order focused on meeting social needs such as government, economy, education, family, healthcare, and religion. 3 types of U.S. institutions would be public education, whose purpose on the surface would be to provide citizens with enough knowledge required to be functioning members of society. Next, we'd have medicine, which is our society's way of handling sickness and injury. And the third would be the U.S. military, who again, on the surface, would be to preserve security for the United States and its territories and provide for defense. Next. Problems within an institution, more specifically the education system. So I believe that the education system within the United States is one of the greatest purveyors of inequality within our social institutions. Resources are unequally distributed based on property taxes, a move deliberately designed to provide advantaged children with better teachers, better facilities, better resources and programs, and altogether a better education. While children who live in poorer neighborhoods and therefore economically disadvantaged receive inferior education. An article from The Atlantic entitled Good School, Rich School, Bad School, Poor School reads, nationally, high poverty districts spend 15.6% less per student than low poverty districts do. Lower spending can irreparably damage a child's future, especially for kids from poor families. However, just a 20% increase in per pupil spending a year for poor children can lead to an additional year of completed education, 25% higher earnings, and a 20 percentage point reduction in incidence of poverty in adulthood. That shows the implications and just how serious the problem of inequality within the public education system actually is. So if you turn your attention to this graph from npr.org on spending per school district, we can see that in some of the most impoverished regions of the United States, like here in the South, spending per student varies as much as less than 33% of the national average per student. And that's quite a discrepancy when in some of the highest regions there's a plus 33% per pupil spending than the national average. Next. Conflict perspective on education. So conflict theorists believe that the educational system actually promotes social inequality. Schools play a role in training working class students to accept their role as lower class members of society. There's inherent racism. Minorities concentrated in disadvantaged neighborhoods receive worse education than white students. And then there's tracking, which leads to self-fulfilling prophecies in which a student lives up to a teacher and eventually society's expectations. In essence, conflict theorists view education as a way to ensure that those who are currently in power stay in power. Next. So, research on inequality in public education. The Condition of Education 2010 is an annual report that utilizes federally mandated data that was collected in order to assess the implications of poverty amongst students. The data was collected by comparing high poverty schools with neighboring low poverty ones. This would be known as secondary data analysis. The NES report from publicschoolreview.com found that the southern and western part of the country saw some of the largest numbers of high poverty schools, while the highest percentages in Mississippi, Louisiana, New Mexico, the District of Columbia, and California. Students at high poverty schools were more likely to be minorities and have limited English proficiency. High poverty schools see an average high school graduation rate of 68%, while the graduation rate at low poverty schools is 91%. Only 28% of high school graduates from high poverty schools enrolled in four-year universities, compared to 52% of graduates from low poverty schools. Next. So, Karl Marx on education inequalities. While Karl Marx never spoke directly on public education, his influence on the subject has been huge, and Marx would explain the inequalities within the public education system the way traditional Marxists see them today. In 2015, an article entitled Marxist Perspectives on Education, Carl Thompson stated that traditional Marxists see the education system as the agenda of the elite. According to the Marxist perspective on education, the system performs three duties for these elites. 1. It reproduces class inequality. 2. It legitimates class inequality. 3. It works in the interest of capitalist employers. It does so because the wealthiest people send their kids to private schools, getting them the best education and therefore the top jobs. Here we see social class reproduction, while poorer kids without the same resources as their better off peers therefore reproduce the same cycle of social class reproduction. Next. So, solutions to public education inequalities. As I recall previously learning in this course in one of the weekly DQs, modern day school integration was greatly solvent for the students who attended impoverished schools and were transferred to neighboring advantaged ones. Using the sociological imagination, one would come to realize that society as a whole, and not just individuals, would benefit from such a move. Because studies show that children who are more involved in their schooling and education are less likely to engage in delinquent and criminal behaviors. And this is extremely advantageous for society as a whole. This lens is one that lets us explore the causality between such things and to see how individual problems become public ones and vice versa. Next. So, in summation, this course has provided me with so much more knowledge into things that I was already interested in. I really wish more people were able to utilize the lens of the sociological imagination. I have learned throughout this course and this assignment that things are rarely just what they appear on the surface. It takes some digging to understand the mechanisms, what goes on in the world around us. So we do have the ability to reduce these types of inequalities and reduce the inequality that we're faced with in society. But it's going to take education, it's going to take dialogue, it's going to take a massive amount of effort and resources in order to challenge some of the pervasive inequalities that seem so deeply ingrained within our system. So I just think that using the sociological imagination is a lens that can help not only individuals but society as a whole in order to move forward and progress into a society where class differences don't come into our daily lives and wreak as much havoc. So I just want to thank you so much for viewing my presentation I've really enjoyed this course, and again, thank you so much.